This is session 5, and here we move from analysis, hopefully, to more strategies for action. A lot of people have been asking about what do we do? So we understand, we analyze, we debate what's next. So this is the session called The Struggle for Palestine, Empowerment Strategies. We will have 5 different perspectives on different topics from 5 distinguished speakers that will be introduced by our moderator. Our moderator for this session is Butheina Hamdah. Butheina is a research associate at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs here at Istanbul Zain University, where she researches issues related to Muslim communities in the United States. Before joining CIGA, Butheina served as leadership assistant and development associate at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. She's also served in other consulting capacities to several nonprofits, and prior to that, spent time in community organizing and youth engagement in her hometown of Toledo, Ohio. Butheina obtained her Bachelor of Arts and Masters of Art degrees in Political Science from the University of Toledo in Ohio. Her graduate thesis focused on liberalism and its impact on religious identity in the American Muslim context. Please welcome Butheina and the rest of the panel.
Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon. I will be chairing this session titled The Struggle for Palestine, Empowerment Strategies. Since I last visited Palestine, what I found most important is the connection between the sentiment of resistance in Palestine and its translation into action through a multitude of vehicles, whether through the media, NGOs, coalition movements and alliances, cultural initiatives, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, or the academy and universities. How do we evaluate the efficacy of these vehicles? Moreover, how do we negotiate the cross-sections of activist movements, whether the roles of youth, women, faith-based movements and secular movements, differing ideologies and contrasting visions? As the struggle increasingly gains recognition and legitimacy, and as the American media, for instance, has problematized the Zionist lobby in an unprecedented fashion, as activist coalitions worldwide take up the Palestinian cause as emblematic of common struggles, and as BDS continues to gain traction and victories, we find ourselves grappling more than ever with critical questions surrounding organizing and empowerment strategies. We hope this panel will address some of those challenges. So without further ado, I extend a welcome to our esteemed panelists. We're joined by Dr. Islah, one of the founders of the Women's Studies Institute at Birzeit University and a Women Affairs Technical Committee, a national coalition for women. She has published many works on Palestinian and Arab women's political participation and political development. Dr. Jad obtained her PhD in Gender and Development from the Department of Development Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, in 2004. She is a senior researcher on gender issues in the Arab region in Palestine and has done many consultations for different Palestinian ministries, international organizations, and NGOs. Dr. Jad is an associate professor working in the Cultural Studies Department and the MA program on Gender and Development at Birzeit University in Palestine. Next, I welcome Dr. Loubna Qutami, who is a President's Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Her research concentrates on Palestinian youth movements. Loubna received a BA in Sociology and an MA in Ethnic Studies, Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas Initiative from San Francisco State University. She also holds a Doctor of Philosophy from the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Riverside. Loubna is a contributing member of the Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and a founder, member, and former International General Coordinator for the Palestinian Youth Movement. Next, I'd like to introduce Ms. Rawan, Al-Damen, who is a filmmaker and media consultant and the CEO and founder of Stream Media Consultancy. She produced and directed more than 30 hours of documentaries, including the award-winning series An-Nakba. As a senior commissioning producer at Al Jazeera Media Network for 10 years, she worked with dozens of filmmakers. She founded and led Palestine Remix, the largest visual interactive website on Palestine. She holds an MA in Communication Studies from Leeds University in the UK. Next, Dr. Ramzy Baroud is a U.S. Arab journalist, media consultant, author, internationally syndicated columnist, editor of the Palestine Chronicle, former managing editor of the London-based Middle East Eye, former editor-in-chief of the Brunei Times, and the former deputy managing editor of Al Jazeera Online. Baroud also served as head of Al Jazeera.net English Research and Studies Department. His latest volume is The Last Earth, A Palestinian Story. Baroud holds a PhD in Palestine Studies from the University of Exeter and is currently a non-resident scholar at the Urfali Center for Global and International Studies, University of California, Santa Barbara. And last but not least, Mr. Frank Barat is a human rights activist, journalist, and author based in Brussels. He was the coordinator of the Russell Tribunal in Palestine and is now the president of the Palestine Legal Action Network. His books include Gaza in Crisis, On Palestine, Corporate Complicity in Israel's Occupation, and Freedom is a Constant Struggle. Frank has written for The New Internationalist, The Palestine Chronicle, ZMAG, Counterpunch, Washington Report on Middle East Affairs, and other publications. Join me in welcoming our panelists. I welcome Dr. Islah to speak on the role of women in the struggle for Palestine.
First, I would like to thank Dr. Sami and all the wonderful team who organized this very stimulating and interesting conference. Since I am given 20 minutes, I will use my time, trying to use my time efficiently. My presentation, unfortunately, it's not really about empowering, but I'm detailing the process of disempowering of the Palestinian women's movement. And why is that? It's because at the end I drew some conclusions that might be helpful for building a future strategy. In order to trace the history and trajectory of Palestinian nationalism and women's activism, I noted that the foundations of class and rural urban cleavages were created by the policies of the British mandate between 17 and 48, exactly the same process that is taking place under the Israeli occupation and also under the Palestinian Authority policies. These policies were built upon and aggravated by the Zionist Hitler state. Under colonial rule, modernization and the national education that it introduced enabled male elites to forge ties with their rural counterparts, but not women. And why is that? Because women were confined in their institutional education that was not Arabized as the main institution, so they were not able to strengthen their class boundaries as male did in urban centers in Palestine during the mandate period. But in general, while Palestinian nationalism constructed women as auxiliary and marginal, it also opened up a new space for women in the public sphere. Thus, regarding women's status, nationalism unleashed both repressive and emancipatory tendencies. The Arabization of the Palestinian cause, for example, that was reflected in the 38 Women of the East Conference in Cairo, and later on in the Arab Women Conference, also in Cairo in 1944, was the result of women's activism in Palestine that pushed Huda Sha'rawi at that time to adopt the Palestinian cause at the pan-Arab level. Success in mobilizing and organizing thousands of women was the ground upon which women activists built their claims to transform the gender order within their parties and in their society at large. Here the picture of women leadership at that time, and we can tell from their clothes, the class background they are coming from. The weakening of the Palestinian economy and its integration first into the Jordanian economy and later on into the Israeli market has been one of the primary causes of women's marginalization in Palestine. As we saw this morning, the level of unemployment is always very high among Palestinians, especially among educated women in Palestine. Whether in the West Bank or in Gaza. In Gaza it reaches 51%, as we saw this morning. In the West Bank it's 45%. So in this regard, contrary to trends in many third world countries and neighboring Arab states in particular, participation by Palestinian women in the labor force, especially in agriculture, went into decline after the Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza that began in 1967, constituting the material basis of Palestinian women's deepening dependency on men. I'm showing this, I mean the macro socio-political context, because when we call for women's equality or women's emancipation without really a material base for this emancipation, our call might fall on deaf ears. Despite these adverse conditions, women activism in Palestine affected the political structure they were affiliated with and society at large. After the military defeat of '67 and the subsequent formulation of Palestinian nationalism, as in earlier instances, did not develop a gender division. And I emphasize this point because there is now a critique of the Islamist movement that they don't have a gender vision. And by tracing the history of Palestinian national movement, them too, they didn't have any gender vision, but women through their activism, they constructed their gender agenda later on. However, the leftist party discourse on women's emancipation provided an important platform on which women activists were able to claim much greater space in the public sphere. Women in the revolution succeeded in establishing constituencies among women in refugee camps in Lebanon. This constituted the basis for their claim for rights later on. And when I say that that was the basis for their claim of rights, because in '81 they started to organize, to draft a specific personal law for women and men within the PLO, and they came up with a fantastic draft in 1982. But unfortunately, they didn't have the time to apply this draft because the expulsion of the resistance movement from Lebanon impeded this initiative. So this shift repeats itself throughout the history of Palestinian national movement and women's movements. Every time they want to develop, some sort of gender agenda within the movement, and the national issue becomes very hot issue, it immediately, froze these initiatives for later on. This was an iconic image representing women in the revolution, this defying, courageous women involved in the military activism. The emergence of a radical and popular local national leadership in the West Bank and Gaza after '67, removed from the direct authoritarian practice of the PLO, was an important step toward the development of strategy for resistance based on people's initiatives and direct participation. It was in this context that grassroots women's organizations emerged in mid-'70s, during which activists were able, for the first time in the Palestinian women's movement, to bridge the divide between urban, middle class, and rural women. I still, I'm emphasizing this important point because later on we will see again, especially after the first uprising, a shift from this, bridged gap between urban and rural women and refugee camps women to again the strengthening of urban women in urban centers through the working of NGOs. Through their activism, women managed to challenge the prevailing gender order and to develop a homegrown feminism that combined the national struggle with the struggle to change the prevailing gender order. So, and this photo might, give an idea about the kind of activists at that time. The globalization of the contemporary secular women's movement, and of course I use secular between quotation, and I will explain later on why I'm doing this, needs to be examined in the broader context of the formation of the Palestinian Authority after the signing of the Oslo Agreement in 1993, which ushered in a phase of quasi-state building that proved illusory. The continuation of the Israeli occupation under the guise of the Oslo peace process resulted in the failure of the PA to establish Palestine as a state and caused the disintegration of the political structure of the PLO and its constituent political parties. I'm saying that it established itself as a quasi-state because all the claim to, all the moves or the activism that developed after Oslo to claim women's rights from a state that has no sovereignty over its land, nor its people, nor its border. This led to the growing influence of the Islamic forces and the subsequent changes that took place in the components of Palestinian nationalism, which had thus far been led by secularists. The emergence of the PA led to radical shifts in the different forms of activism in civil society. This aimed to sustain the Palestinian communities and to mobilize and organize them to resist the occupation. Women were active participants in both these processes. To understand, the shift to the so-called gender agenda after Oslo and the emerging of many women's NGOs, one has to understand the structure of aid to the Palestinians. And as we see from the structure, far to the right, the quartet is the supreme power, under which there are many administrative levels, and these administrative levels, we have donors, we have Palestinians, we have Arab counterparts, and we have GOI. It took me 9 months to understand what GOI stands for. No one could tell me what is GOI among all Palestinian bureaucrats I know of. And it turned out that GOI is the government of Israel, on top of the aid structure for all Palestinian ministries, and Israel is one of the decision makers in these bodies to decide about what projects should be implemented and what projects should not be implemented. Oslo and the demobilization of women's movement, the decline that resulted in the decline of the General Union of Palestinian Women, and I will not bore you with the reasons for that, we can discuss it later on. The Democrats, or the move of most of the women leaders that shouldered the first Palestinian uprising through their grassroots organizations, big part of them moved to serve as femocrats or feminist bureaucrats in the Palestinian Authority, and the disintegration of Fatah as a social and political movement, and the continuous harassment of all social movements, especially teachers and students. And of course, the fruits of elections among these bodies that were part of the PLO structure, especially the General Union of Palestinian Women. Analysis of the brand feminism developed by NGO discourse, which is based on a universal rights approach, demonstrates how discourse in such a context is not simply a matter of words, but crucially involves frames of collective action with social movements at their power structure. The new discourse used by the NGO elite after Oslo might be seen to discredit all forms of organization and to co-opt popular groups. NGO discourse claimed that legitimacy founded on resistance and sacrifice led to the subordination and isolation of women, which had to be challenged. Women NGOs belies the claim that NGOs are model, participatory, and inclusive agents for development. Furthermore, the emphasis on professionalism represented the interests of the privileged few who sought to consolidate their own power base. Thus, professionalism failed to enable the articulation and promotion of gender interests, whether practical or strategic, at the level of society or the state. And of course, the easy way here was follow CIDAW and apply CIDAW, and everything would be okay for women, which was not, the case in the context of Palestine. Professionalism didn't lead to greater inclusion of target groups or broader participation in decision-making process for any project. The project logic, as I call, pushed toward vertical accountability rather than horizontal accountability. The project logic places greater power in the hands of administrators, thus making NGO structure exclusive rather than inclusive, and as I said, it revived again the urban center, the urban-rural divide. As donors are driven by the logic of the efficient deployment of their funds, NGO leaders and staff experience pressure to prove their high level of professionalism. And when I say violence, violence everywhere, because amid this gloomy situation that we have been following since this morning, and the harassment and the settlements and the terrible level of Israeli violence, all the first strategic objective of, for example, the Ministry of Women's Affairs in the West Bank is how to fight the domestic violence. And here violence was completely separated from its general context, and the question of violence through these projects and the huge channel of funding for issues related to GBV or gender-based violence transferred the question of violence from a national issue into an internal Palestinian issue as represented in the male chauvinism or Palestinian patriarchy. The link here, I will skip this, and I will skip this because I still have less than 5 minutes. I'm moving to say that the individualization of the gender agenda, depending on the will or the objectives of the donors, also reached the national agenda. It means that there was a huge amount of funds that were channeled to encourage the peace building between Israeli women and Palestinian women, both united by the fight against patriarchy, irrespective of the dilemma of the Palestinian national context. However, in this respect, we see that the leaders representing Palestinian women in this international forum that used to be used to speak about the settler colonial project in Palestine moved to speak about how to come together to fight patriarchy and chauvinism. The Islamist women forged a public space for a certain category of women, those who are educated from poor, mainly refugee backgrounds. So I'm detailing, the process through which the civil society activism leaves a huge space for a newcomer to activism in the Palestinian context. And here I spoke in details for the first time about Islamist women of Hamas, who managed to attract thousands of women by going back again to the old national women's agenda, which is supporting the families and the people who are the victims of the Israeli project in Palestine. Of course, we heard about the schism between both. The schism also touched upon, the relationship between women, especially after the winning of Hamas, the legislative election of 2006, and the nomination for the first time of a women minister coming from Hamas in the Ministry of Women's Affairs. The minister was beaten by nationalist women and rejecting her as a backward, conservative, religious, against all the gender agenda developed by the women's movement. As I detailed before, the agenda was developed to some extent by the donor community. So, I have 3 minutes, 4. And of course, the critique, they also touched upon the Sharia as a guiding principle, not CIGA. So Sharia here is seen as a very conservative and backward set of ideas that cannot emancipate women in the Palestinian context. The Islamist women, and here I studied, their discourse and the evolution of their gender vision, because Hamas as Fatah in the PLO did not have a gender agenda, but through activism, women were touching upon issues that women are suffering from, whether issues related to violence or lack of equality when it comes to issues like custody or equal pay or similar issues. So at the beginning, the point was that they were rejecting totally any claims by the secularist women, claim of rights, that Islam gives women all rights, etc. And after that, the following year, they started to engage with what they are saying, and through engagement, they started themselves to develop their own vision about what should be a gender agenda for an Islamist women's movement. So the same debate on Sharia triggered internal soul-searching within the Islamist movement itself, pressured by the feminist secularist women's groups. The Islamists has to present their own alternative vision based on Sharia. For this, they had to engage with the opposition. In their discourse, they rejected and refuted the total equality approach. At the same time, highly educated and professional Islamist women were using total equality in their daily practice to defend equal rights for women in the public sphere, specifically in relation to work and political activism. Islamists, in their quest to define themselves as a national movement, borrowed from and incorporated new visions to broaden their constituencies. The revival of struggle, retain, and sacrifice, a falling apart nation, they are claiming rights from a state that doesn't exist. They are claiming rights from a nation that is threatened in its existence. And this is not the moment to take from the nation, it is still the moment to give. So this is, to go back to the mode order of the Palestinian national movement that built its national identity on return, sacrifice, and struggle. So they recuperated these slogans again, and they formulated their agenda around these issues. And they targeted, as I said, all people and families affected by the colonial Israeli policies. Here we see that the faces are becoming different. The leaders in the streets are, Islamist women, and not as I showed before. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Jed. Next, I would like to offer the stage to Dr. Loubna Qutami to discuss the role of the youth.
Good afternoon. I'd like to begin by thanking Dr. Sami Al-Arian and all the team at CIGA and all the people who are making this convening possible for us. I'm truly honored to be sharing the platform with esteemed colleagues and comrades and to be thinking and reflecting together on Palestinian liberation. So, Frantz Fanon, anti-colonial intellectual giant, once notes, every generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission and either fulfill it or betray it. Few words have hurt the Palestinians so deeply as the words peace process. The peace process, crystallized in the 1993 Oslo Accords, signifies for Palestinians the parceling of Palestinian land, the decimation of Palestinian rights, segmentation of Palestinian geographies and constituencies, and desutures of the social and political fabric of the transnational Palestinian nation, once organized by an umbrella known as the PLO. It also signifies the establishment of a complex neoliberal system of racial capitalism, all while under occupation, a racial capitalism that makes Palestine a debt-based economy, that makes the NGO expansion of Palestine create new tendencies in social and cultural life, tendencies of individualism. It signifies the proliferation of a national economic and political comprador class to act as the new gatekeepers to colonization, to stifle dissent from its peripheries and from its streets, to deepen its political, economic, and security coordination with our own colonial forces. Of course, that starts in 1993 and expands tremendously after 2007. It signifies the expansion of Zionist colonization, encroachment on lands, a more robust militarization, and incurred violences on Palestinian land and life. And it signifies leaving behind 5 million Palestinian refugees to perish in camps in the region, experiencing catastrophes all over again by new wars. But a new generation was told that they should expect to revel in the fruits of statehood, of the so-called rights of citizenry and sovereignty. Instead, a new generation was left to shoulder the wounds and traumas of passed-on generations, as well as their own. But they were also left with no institutional transition of liberation strategy, narrative, consciousness, training, organization. Parties were weakened. Heroes of the historic record, killed, imprisoned, or becoming the new faces of the Palestinian Authority, policing Palestine's youth. Palestine became locked into a web of factionalist division, especially after the 2006 parliamentary elections, in which the factionalist division between Hamas and Fatah expands to become a territorialized division, creating new arbitrary definitions of Palestinian fragmentation, inside, outside, Hamas, Fatah, Muwatin, Lajah. Oslo was a Nakba for the Palestinians. I've been asked today to talk about the role of Palestinian youth in Palestine, but I'd like to rather reflect on the quote that I introduced this talk with, about Frantz Fanon talking about each generation needing to discover its mission and either fulfill it or betray it. I wonder if we might think about how the particular positionality of Palestinian youth in the aftermath of the Oslo Accords, if we can reconsider what youth means, if it's not defined by an age bracket or by time, and we actually think of this particular position that the new generation is in comprehensively across time and space, if new opportunities for liberation might become present for us. In order to do so, I'd like to reflect on the methodological process of youth organizing, and I want to share some reflections on two different generations. The first, what's known as Jil al-Thawra, or the generation of the revolution, the first student and youth organizers in the aftermath of the 1948 Nakba. And the second, what is dubbed as Jil Oslo, or the Oslo generation. And particularly, I'll be focusing on the Palestinian youth movement. I'd like to start off by saying, reflecting on Patrick Wolf's understanding of invasion being a structure, not an event. It's come up several times in the conference by Dr. Ilham Pape. If we understand invasion as a structure and not an event, then maybe we can actually see that these two disparate generations of the 1950s and of the early 2000s actually shared very much in common. They were both attempting to overcome a void, a particular void, even though conditions had become very different, but a void nonetheless. In the 1950s, Abu Iyad, who was one of the first Palestinian student organizers of the Palestine Student Union, later would become one of the founders of Fatah and a vital player in the political movement, the national liberation struggle. He talked about the Nakba as producing a quote-unquote gap in our souls. If we were to think of the gap of our souls that Abu Iyad speaks of as an impulse for the something that's to be done, this is what the first thing that Palestinian students and youth were responding to in the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s. But the importance of what they were responding to is that they did not have a complete handle on what had just happened to them. The Nakba had produced a shock and trauma to Palestinian social, political, and cultural life. As I mentioned yesterday in a Q&A, Consultancy said that one of the tragedies of the Nakba was that it produced a shattering of Palestinian society. People were left scattered, but their ideas were also left to roam. And so the importance of the original student organizers of the 1940s and 50s is that as they were trying to diagnose the Palestinian condition, they were simultaneously trying to develop methods out of that condition, strategies out of that condition, and political visions that could get them out of that position, all simultaneously. Jil Thawra, in responding to the gap in our souls, first started with the social needs of their constituency. In 1944, the Palestine Student Union in Cairo started organizing around student scholarships that were being revoked from Palestinian students. There they were learning the techniques of sit-ins, of civil disobedience, of protest, and were persecuted for it after 1948, with the first arrests happening from protests about students sitting in to protest scholarships being denied to them. But another important thing about the students is that they were diagnosing and articulating the experience, needs, and aspirations of the Palestinian masses, and creating a narrative that organized the first iteration of the Palestine frame. This would become obvious in the PSU 1952 elections, in which presidential and vice presidential elections, in which Yasser Arafat and Abu Iyad would run on a slogan of trying to define and create Palestinian self-reliance and Palestinian identity in exile, responding to the distrust that they had of Arab regimes and of the sense that Palestinian students needed to assume agency as history makers and as reconciling the damage that the Nakba had produced. They argued that they wanted to, quote-unquote, put Palestine back on the map. They told this to their people in their refugee camps. They disseminated it in literature, newsletters, booklets. But they also used that slogan of putting Palestine back on the map to communicate the Palestinian struggle to the international community, to dispel the notions of Palestinians as bloodthirsty terrorists of Zionist character, to generate international solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, and to generate a place at the table with international struggles and movements across the world. They also served, Palestinian students also served as the interlocutors, literally and theoretically, between the Palestinian masses and regional and global actors. The PSU, for example, would be the first Palestine student group to sit at the table in the International Union of Students backed by the Eastern Bloc. There they gathered strategies, resources, information on how they could develop their own anti-colonial struggle. Similarly, the experience of the 1951 presidential elections of the Urwa, Jam'iyyat al-Urwa al-Wifqa, George Habash runs for president as the student organization, and runs on the campaign slogan of wanting to turn the Palestinian cause into a struggle of mass mobilization, a popular struggle, a revolutionary struggle. These ideas and theories were informed by the literatures that they were reading, by the forums in which they were meeting students and political figures from across third world anti-colonial struggles. But the Palestinians, in the creation of the Palestinian national identity and national trajectory that was fomenting within the Palestinian student groups in the early 1950s, it also was complemented by their study of structures that would be suitable for their condition as a scattered and dispossessed people. They wanted to create a Palestinian national discourse, a structure and a strategy in which they could have a role in the liberation of their country and the return of all refugees, though they were not sharing a shared landmass amongst one another. In 1958, Palestinian students in Iraq would learn about the General Union model from Abdul Karim al-Qasim's communist General Union model that was spreading in Iraq. But by 1959, those Palestinian students had been experiencing an exodus to Syria because they were accused of having Ba'ath and Arab nationalist sensibilities. Their proposal of a joint federation for the different Palestinian groups between Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt had finally reached the PSU. And in 1959, the establishment of the General Union of Palestine Students was created. The GUPS, which would later on become the largest popular union of the PLO, the GUPS was the first iteration of a national democratic space of various Palestinian geographies and political ideologies. It was a space in which an articulation of a national struggle was first fomented. Not by coincidence, the very same years that the Palestinian parties are formed and as guerrilla insurgency is fomenting in the early 1960s. In GUPS's 1962 conference, they would resolve that they believed in the creation of a Palestinian entity. In 1964, when the Arab nations created the PLO, or resolved to create the PLO, the GUPS was not happy. They argued that the PLO was comprised of Palestinian elites, too agile to do anything about the conditions, and too disconnected from the struggle in order to actually understand what the masses needed and wanted. Still, they maintained relations with the PLO, asked the PLO for resources and money, told them not to interfere in their own elections. Didn't feel that the PLO had held up their end of the bargain. By 1965, the GUPS students, who at the time were comprised of an Arab nationalist majority in the executive committee, decided to host their own conference in Egypt, in which they invited global actors from across the world, students and non-students, to talk about the relationship between Palestine, the region, and the African continent. There, they deepened their international solidarity, relationships, networks, and resources, alongside a brewing Fidai movement and alongside the development of the Palestinian parties. Fast forward, Gilles Oslo. In 2006, 30 Palestinian youth from across Europe and the Arab region and in Palestine gathered in Barcelona, Spain, to discuss the current status of the Palestinian liberation movement. There, they talked about the necessity to create some sort of form and order to Palestinian social and political life, ruptured by the Oslo Accords. They talked about their grievances with the Palestinian political establishment 13 years after the Oslo Accords and Palestinian parties were fighting each other. Israel became increasingly obsolete. The occupation, though expanding, was nowhere in the discussion of Palestinian political concerns. But they were also responding to a new phenomenon in Palestinian political life, the curbing depoliticization of Palestinian youth through the NGO sector that treated Palestinian troubles as geographic aberrations or as a problem of cultural deficiency, that did not recognize a political colonial history. The youth wanted to reorient the role of the Shatat. The Shatat are still Palestinian. They must have a role in the national struggle. They are not solidarity activists. They are not humanitarian aid workers. There's only so much work that we can do to expose Israel, but what is our alternative? Between 2006 and 2010, the PYM came to produce over 24 meetings, conferences, focus groups, campaigns, summer schools, and summer camps. During those years, they were diagnosing the struggles of the new generation, the assets of the new generation, and their aspirations for freedom, justice, and liberation. By 2009, the PYM had recognized that the biggest crisis affecting Palestinian youth was a crisis of identity, a crisis of authenticity competitions, oppression Olympics, and delegitimization amongst one another based on factionalist divisions, ideological divisions, geographic, social, and cultural divisions, similar to what we'd heard in the panel earlier this morning. But by 2009, the PYM decided to contribute an entire program, a 1-month-long summer program in Damascus, in which they would come together to discuss what a collective Palestinian identity in the contemporary context was. That program led to the first major program of the PYM in 2010 in the Basque Country in Spain, where they would identify their first post-identity politics articulations. They stopped talking about identity as being something natural, as Palestinians being naturally bound to one another into the land, and started to foment more serious political ideas and principles. In 2011, in April of 2011, the PYM would meet for its second International General Assembly here in Istanbul. And there, they would change their name from the Palestinian Youth Network to the Palestinian Youth Movement and adopt a new structure, a structure similar to the structure of the GUPS in 1959. A transnational umbrella for youth movements who will come from different geographic and ideological backgrounds to develop iterations of a national trajectory for the liberation of Palestine. But by 2011, all of the planning that the PYM had done had changed because of the Arab uprisings. One of the things that the PYM had talked about at the time was creating analytical tools and principles, not positions, and ideas, not ideologies. That was a necessary component in order to bring together Palestine's fractured transnational nation. But by that time, in trying to articulate more clear political principles, youth groups who were part of the political parties felt that they could not participate in the PYM. Calling itself a movement meant that it was a new party in competition with other political parties, with the establishment. PYM continued to develop its trajectory, at the time realizing that the most important thing that it needed to do was start focusing, quote unquote, on the ground. Transnational convenings, bringing together Palestinian youth from different organizations and factions, was not as important anymore now that a general framework has been built for the PYM. What was important were bases on the ground that could mobilize the masses, that could create a new revolutionary consciousness in Palestinian society, that can allow us to overcome the hardened forms of fragmentation that exist within Palestinian society. But at the time, there were other matters of concern for the PYM. The Arab uprisings required the PYM to actually have positions. Though the PYM was not in a position to have positions, the Arab street demanded it of them. And so PYM decided to focus on the Arab context at that time, to take a step away from the Palestinian context. Why? Because in 2011, as the Arab region was overcome with revolutionary zeal by its youth, Palestinian youth were rising up in Palestine to call for an end to the split in national unity, to call for an end to security cooperation between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli security apparatus. And simultaneously, the Palestinian Authority was going to the United Nations to bid for statehood, started in 2011, but officially at the end of 2012. So here's the paradox. The moment that there's a revolutionary moment happening in the Arab region, the Palestinians are actually calling for restabilization of the existing status quo, a false pretense of a state with its bureaucracy, with its responsibility, but without any of the rights and freedoms in order to actually guarantee Palestinian liberation of land and life. In 2012, the PYM hosted one of its most monumental gatherings, the Arab Youth for Dignity and Liberation Conference, in the newly liberated Tunisia, with the conference sponsored and supported by the president. That moment was vital for the PYM. We were asking the question of the relationship between Palestine and the Arab region, the incomplete Palestinian revolution, and new prospects for liberated region, for liberation within the region. But the isolation that the PYM experienced in the Palestinian national scene limited their abilities to actually partake in the Arab region. In the absence of positions on the divisions happening within the broader region, and in the absence of coalitional spaces and bases on the ground that could sustain the fractures that the Arab uprisings had created. In the years following, the PYN experienced an immense internal crisis. I share these reflections on the methods, challenges, ambitions of Palestinian youth of two disparate generations to talk about the ways that Palestinian youth are considering organizing as a central component to the Palestinian struggle. Our struggle is not one that can just be won with the war of words or with a social media post. We are scattered, dispossessed, and under an increasingly robust, violent military occupation. But how do we get out of the difficulty and the deadlock of our own political establishment? Well, in my final thoughts, I'd like to share a couple reflections of the opportunities and challenges in this current time, some years after the Arab uprisings. First, we must come to think of youth not as a sector of society any longer. We must come to think of youth as a political optic, one that is ripe with revolutionary tenets for liberation. And if we can do that without separating the current generation from past generations' struggles, if we can find a way to understand how youth can learn from past generations, how there can be a more robust intergenerational conversation on organization, then we might be able to do so. As Dr. Rabah Abdelhadi mentioned this morning, in order to do that, the imaginations of hope, the imaginations of possibility is critical. Everything in Palestinian youth, everything in the world of Palestinian youth today tells us that we cannot dream, that we cannot hope, that we cannot envision possibility. And those limitations, those imminent limitations, prohibit us from actually being able to devise a plan to get out of our situation. Second, the changes since the Arab uprisings. Today, Palestinian youth share more common sense ground about our current political conditions than the PYM youth did in 2006. Palestinian youth have shared articulations, common sense shared articulations about the problems in Palestinian political life. There's a shared acknowledgement of the void of any liberation project on the table in which youth can actively partake. There's a shared articulation of how that void is actually filled with crowded gatekeepers. There's a shared articulation of the shifts from political despair to rising up on all levels. In 2006, we were trying to figure out how we can rise up. Today, Palestinian youth are rising up everywhere and on all levels. Prisoners on hunger strike. It's not just for Palestinian youth, it's for all Palestinians. Prisoners on hunger strike, artists, cultural workers, people within boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement in the Far Shatat. On all levels, there is an insurgency of Palestinian youth activity. But the challenges, we are less organized than we were even 10 years ago. The new generation is has less familiarity with organizational structure and organizational history, less able to accumulate upon political gains, and less familiar with what it means to build institutions and operate in institutions that foster collective accountability and collective politics. Because of this, new Palestinian generations are initiating knowledge projects across Palestine and across the Arab region and in the Far Shatat. These knowledge projects are looking at history, at different experiences of Palestinian political parties, of the experiences of the different student groups, and different phases in history to think about how we can accumulate upon our history, rather than acknowledging and allowing for the Oslo Accords to be another Nakba segmenting us from history. I'd like to end with a quote by Ahmed Diab, who talked about the catastrophe that happened in Yarmouk camp in Syria. He says, rather than enduring existential crisis, Palestinians learn to deal with existence as crisis. This is the stuff of nation building. And Palestinian youth today, through the crises that they're enduring, through the catastrophes that they're enduring, are trying to build their nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Qutami. Next, I welcome Ms. Rawan Al-Damen on creating a media strategy.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'm very glad to be here today. Good afternoon, everybody. It's not an easy job to be the third speaker in a session of the afternoon session of 5 speakers, but I am really honored to be with such great 5 speakers, Islah, Loubna, Ramzy, and Frank, and really honored to be amongst all of you, dear friends and colleagues who are passionate about Palestine and what we can do today. I'm really thankful for CIGA, Islah University, and the sponsors, Dr. Sami Al-Aryan and his team, Fadi, Linda, Riyadh, Butheina, Imad, Yunus, everybody who is trying to make this happen today. Our session with the title, The Struggle for Palestine Empowerment Strategies, I'm speaking today about the media in particular. Palestine creating a media strategy. In the aim of one of the main aims of this conference, to empower people in Palestine and around the world toward realizing the essential elements for resolving the conflict and achieving the vital goals of justice, freedom, inclusion, and lasting peace. My name is Rawan Al-Damen. I'm a Palestinian filmmaker and media consultant, and this is me in the digital world, filming and trying to do something in the media for Palestine. I was born in Amman, Jordan, to a Palestinian family and raised as a kid that I am Palestinian. And as a kid in the school, I worked with my sister for 6 years on oral history books, where we published 2 books on the oral history of Palestine. The second was The Expulsion in the Memory of Children, published in 1997, with tens of stories from people who were kids in 1948 between the age 8 and 16. Later, we participated in a chapter on this book in A Teen's Life in the Middle East book. But at that time, when I was at school, this is how media looks like. I remember these TVs, radios, and newspapers. Most of you here, maybe only the undergraduate students, won't recognize these media things. And this is when I entered Birzeit University in Palestine, where I did my undergraduate in media and sociology. I was in Birzeit only last week, spending 3 weeks as a voluntary teacher for the media courses there. And I'm talking to the undergraduates here at Islah University. Utilize your every moment at the campus of any university. And here you are lucky to have such a wonderful campus and a wonderful library as well. I remember spending many hours at Birzeit Library, and the librarians there, till now they are there, they remember this girl that was reading all the time. At that time, I discovered the first pillar of what I would suggest today as the media strategy 4 pillars. And the first is to produce things. We lack content on Palestine in different languages, including also Arabic, but also in English, Spanish, French, German, Italian. And at Birzeit, I did my first mini documentary, Waiting for Light. It's available on YouTube. Everything I'll mention in this presentation is available on YouTube. It's a 10-minute documentary done in the Easter time, like this time, 18 years ago, in 2001, on a Christian family in Palestine. Not allowed, they live in Ramallah, and not allowed to go to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem to celebrate Easter. And the film was on VHS at that time. I sent it to Milano Film Festival in Italy. And at that time, I got an email on the old Yahoo email. Gmail and Google did not exist. And the email looked like this. It was April, like this month, but 2001. And I got this email from somebody whom I didn't know, named Binyamino Sabeni. And he said, it's a long time that we are looking for contributions from young Palestinian authors, and I'm really happy that finally someone answered to our call. Every year they get at least 2 films from Israel. And at the end there's a note. I personally take the occasion to express my solidarity to your people and to its eternal struggle for its country. So dramatic in these days. I would be happy to give any help if needed. Don't give up. It meant a lot to a 22-year-old girl at Birzeit University graduating at that time. And I decided that this is what I will do for the rest of my life, to use media as an empowerment tool and strategy for Palestine. And I was lucky to be among the generation where we got YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and Google, and all of this appeared at that time. I felt that we can have the whole world at the tips of our fingers. And this led me to the second pillar of this strategy, that is to make it accessible. It's not enough to produce things, but now it's much easier and cheaper to make it accessible. I was working with schools at that time and was asking Palestinian girls who are their Palestinian role model of women. And I was surprised that they don't have role model of current Palestinian women. And this is why I decided to do my first series on women pioneers, and I chose two Palestinians. One is Mrs. Tamam al-Akhal, who has been drawing for Palestine for the last 60 years. This is one of her drawings. She was expelled from Jaffa in 1948 when she was 14 years old. And she drew with her late husband, Ismail Shammout, wonderful pictures and drawings for Palestine. And this was my first documentary of 2 hours available only in Arabic. And the second is Salma al-Khadra al-Jayusi, who's famous in the West much more than Palestine and the East, because she translated 40 books from Arabic to English, and including modern Palestinian literature and novels. After doing those stories, I understood that our problem is with Al-Nakba narrative. That's the main thing that we need to work upon. And I started saying that Al-Nakba did not start in 1948 and did not end in 1948. Dr. Ilan Pape mentioned this morning the 1882 as the first time of the formal Zionism coming to the shores of Palestine. But in my Al-Nakba series, a 4-hour documentary available in 10 different languages on YouTube now, Spanish, Italian, French, English, German, even the sign language, including, of course, Arabic and English, I started from 1799 until today. And why I was amazed that many Palestinians, when they talk about Al-Nakba, they get this symbolic old woman in front of the tent or the keep. And I hated this. I didn't like it at all. This is not our Nakba. And I decided that I'll use this always as a symbol of Al-Nakba. And people get surprised. Is this the Palestinian Nakba? Yes, it is. Those boys were part of the Orthodox Jaffa school in Palestine in 1938. And as it's mentioned on the image itself, it was taken on the 15th of June 1938. And at that time, I imagined those kids telling each other that we will have a reunion 10 years from now. We'll come again to our school and have a picture exactly like this one in our school. But 10 years later, in June 1948, the school is still there until today, but none of them is in Jaffa, and none of them can even visit their school. This is the Palestinian Nakba. This is what happened in 1948. It is available in Turkish language also, so I would like the Turkish people to watch Al-Nakba in Turkish language. And the most after Al-Nakba that I was very touched with is the Palestinians inside Israel, whom I found that their story of Palestinians Israelis is very complicated. They themselves even are not able to tell it in a very straightforward way. And I spent 2 years reading everything they wrote about themselves. I'd like to show you only 1 minute from this.
فلسطين أحمل الجنسية الإسرائيلية. إحنا ما رحناش محل، ما هاجرناش، إحنا مش لاجئين. نحن لم نختار المواطنة الإسرائيلية، هي فرضت علينا.
احنا جزء لا يتجزأ من الشعب العربي الفلسطيني.
والدتي دائما تقول انه بسمونا عرب 48 وبسمونا عرب الداخل، احنا عرب الوطن.
And I called them owners of the land because they are. And I'm very glad that Dr. Muhannad, who was part of this series when he was doing his PhD at that time, or part of this series. I think also it's very important when we want to produce and make it accessible is to study the Oslo, which was mentioned many times this morning and yesterday. But yet, to understand it, we need to understand the Egypt-Israel relation. And this is why there's 1 hour documentary that I did called The Bitter Peace, which is on the archive and narration, telling the story of first Camp David. Let's watch 1 minute of this archive.
We came to Camp David with all the goodwill and faith we possessed, and we left Camp David a few minutes ago with a renewed sense of hope and inspiration.
The Camp David Conference should be renamed. It was the Jimmy Carter Conference. As far as my historic experience is concerned, I think that he worked harder than our forefathers did in Egypt building the pyramids.
You need to watch the whole thing. Then The Price of Oslo, which is a 2 hours documentary telling what happened really in 1993. As Dr. Hani Masri mentioned in the session before the lunch, the story started in 1974. And this is when the film really starts, because the 1993 did not start at that time. But during the 9 months, from January until September 1993, the Norwegian Foreign Ministry paid the whole expenses of the whole negotiations, having the Norwegians, Israelis, and Palestinians in Norway secretly. But till today, there is not a single document of a 1 minute of meetings from those negotiations of 9 months, even not a single image, even not a single video. And this makes our narrative very complicated. We don't have any document, any still, any video, and we are supposed to produce and make it accessible for our people to understand what happened. It is also available in Turkish language and Spanish and English. Producing 10 documentaries on Palestine, and I was privileged to work with Al Jazeera Media Network in Doha, Qatar for 10 years as a senior commissioner. And I commissioned 250 documentaries, 80 of them on Palestine. And at that time, I discovered the third pillar of our strategy that we need to work with is to advocate and use this material. And this is when we launched what Butheina mentioned in the beginning of the introduction, Palestine Remix, PalestineRemix.com, which I was lucky to work with a wonderful team of freelancers and employees of Al Jazeera Network to create it. This is the main page in English and in Turkish. It's available in Arabic, English, Turkish, Bosnian, and also recently in Spanish. And the main idea of Palestine Remix that I was always telling my friends and colleagues like you to watch Al-Nakba 4 hours, Owners of the Land 5 hours, Bitter Peace 1 hour, and The Price of Oslo 2 hours. And then we'll meet again in a year or a couple of years, and I'll discover that none of them watched the documentaries. And so I said, we need to find another way to get people into those documentaries. And the idea was to get excellent documentaries from different directors around the world, like Gaza We Are Coming, for a Greek director on breaking the siege on Gaza, going against the grain about Gideon Levy and how he was transformed to be against Zionism, Hunger Strike on the Palestinian prisoners in the Israeli prisons, all available in the different languages, Stronger Than Words, which I use always about the deaf community in Gaza Strip. It's all in sign language. The pain inside on the new Israelis, the young Israelis who after the mandatory of the military service go to India or to Berlin, and what they say about the Zionism project and Israel. All those documentaries are available both in the video and in the text, which means It's searchable. You can write there the word Jerusalem and reach to every single place Jerusalem was mentioned within the documentaries, as the documentaries are on YouTube like a black box. But then you can go within those documentaries and find an extract, 1 minute from any documentary, mix and match with another extract from another documentary, and build your own story and share it on social media. Even download the file and use it in your university class or in your PowerPoint for your students. And we managed to get Palestine Remix as an educational tool in many universities around the world, especially in America, in Europe, in East Asia, and in the Arab world. And we are having, for the last 5 years, around 1,000 new visitors every month from the students themselves, undergraduates and postgraduates. Al-Shabaka, Ala Tartir, has been using it for a long time in Holland as well. And so it's available in Arabic, in Bosnian, and in Turkish. All the documentaries about Palestine. Recently, we did all of them in Spanish, and they are available on YouTube. And for the last 3 years, working as a freelance, I was thinking, what's next? We had to advocate things, we had to market things more, but is there anything new we need to produce? And I found out that yes, animation is a big thing. We need, as Palestinians, to be there. And this is why we did a 7-minute animation in both Arabic and English called the Balfour-like Declaration, which we used as the story of Palestine for the kids at schools from 1799 until today, and as well as virtual reality, 360. We did with the team in Jerusalem stories about the life inside Jerusalem in 360 virtual reality. I wouldn't need to tell you how many Zionist projects are there in the virtual reality and how rarely you have the word Palestine even in an index for the virtual reality. But to do this, to produce, to make it accessible, and then to advocate is not enough. We need to network. There is some experiments that we did with the International Forum for Palestinian Media and Communication. We were very happy to have Dr. Al-Aryan in our last conference attending here in Istanbul. We have been doing this conference every 2 years, once in Istanbul. And we launched also the Media Creativity Award for Palestine, which I initiated, and I was, do you remember, last year, trying to convince Palestinians, pro-Palestinians, to do creative work for Palestine, not only to do work for Palestine. And later I discovered, not like as a kid, when I was so fascinated that we have for the first time YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram later, and Google, I discovered that as a kid, they are all as the monopoly we were playing when we were children. They are monopolies, and they are also tools that the Zionist project use also to suppress our voice. But we are the one person in the red color. We can do something, and we should. And this is why what I suggest for this conference maybe and for other organizations connected to the conference is to use the Palestine media strategy 4 key goals. The first is producing evidence, to produce and continue to produce high quality, relevant, long shelf, up-to-date, systematic print, audiovisual, and interactive digital material based on in-depth research and clear evidences to inform. Many of our media about Palestine is news-oriented and not long shelf, and this is a real problem. And the second goal is making our evidence accessible. To make it accessible and useful to everybody, everywhere in the world, to utilize the huge content we have available for different audiences, different content based on language, age, and interest. Advocate for this evidence, to use this media content widely in all our gatherings, conferences, platforms, discussions. This is really a problematic issue. Many people in this hall do not know that this content do exist, although they are interested about Palestine. To market it and become informative, entertaining advocates for evidence-informed decisions on Palestine. To build an effective and sustainable networking body. To be a diverse, inclusive, and transparent international networking body that effectively harness the enthusiasm and skills of our people to make optimal use of our media resources. Nowadays, you don't need to be a media person to be part of the media strategy. whether you can produce or make it accessible or advocate using it or be part of the network. Any of us in this hall and all over the pro-Palestine can be part of a media strategy. It's no longer only for media people. Palestine is still there. Yes, the Zionist project managed to erase its name from the atlas of the world, but in the digital world, we can get it, and we can get it in the right way, so the world will know about what's happening in Palestine, what happened, what's happening, and what should change. I do believe that trusted media content, accessible, can get us free Palestine. Thank you very much.
Mr. Al-Damen. Next, Dr. Ramzy Baroud, who will speak on empowering Palestinian voices.
I'm very honored to be back in Istanbul. Thank you very much, Dr. Sami, the Center for Islamic and Global Affairs, Zaim University, but especially my thanks goes to the Turkish people. Because in all honesty, without the support of peoples around the world, from Turkey to Malaysia and Indonesia, to Brazil, to Chile, to South Africa, to France, Britain, the United States, and elsewhere, we wouldn't have a movement. We wouldn't have solidarity. We wouldn't have resources. We wouldn't have allies. We wouldn't have the kind of potential that allows us to come together and to talk about strategies. In fact, as far as Israel is concerned, they had hoped that the Palestinians will just disappear. They never viewed us as Palestinians as a distinct nation to begin with. We were Arabs. And not Arabs as the Arab people, but Arabs as just nomadic tribes that are constantly on the move. And Palestinians, after the Nakba, will find a home somewhere else. They will assimilate. They will move on. But we haven't. And the reason why we haven't is not because we have this incredible, savvy, strategic, visionary, forward-looking leadership. It's despite the fact that we have none of that. The reason we are still there, we're still talking about Palestine, we're still advocating the rights of the Palestinian people, is that because of the Palestinian people. And I think this is very important, the relevance of people to our discussions. Academic discourses sometimes can be quite disconnecting and alienating if they are not applied to real life situations. I think one of the last things that Edward Said warned from before he passed away was the fact that we are delving way too much in theory. And we are forgetting that there are people, faces, names, and a reality that exists beyond theory. And academia moves so very slowly. It takes us a long time to adopt new terminology and new theories and new discourses. And by that time, things would have moved on and so forth. I was going to start with a quote by Said. Then I thought maybe Fanon, maybe Gramsci, maybe Ghassan Kanafani. I like them all. It's really tough to choose. But then I decided to tell you more about this guy who can neither write or read. His name is Ali Ibn Ghassib. Ali Ibn Ghassib is not an intellectual, although Gramsci argued that each one of us is capable of being a public intellectual, even though we do not subscribe to that role in society, but everyone is indeed capable of being intellectual, but Ali is not. Ali is a fighter. I was introduced to Ali by a friend of mine, Yusuf Al-Jamal, sitting over here. I think he's like one of the best kept secrets about Turkey. He moved to Turkey to do his PhD from Gaza. Brilliant scholar, and I think you should absolutely. He has helped so many of us who are unable to get to Gaza, connected us with a lot of people, and made our work accessible and possible. So thank you, Yusuf, for all of that. He introduced me to this guy. His name is Ali Al-Mursi. Initially, I was writing a book called The Lost Earth that came out last year. I write in a genre that is called People's History. The reason I am so enchanted with this genre is I was born and raised in a refugee camp in Gaza myself. And when I left Gaza, I left the refugee camp I was 22 years old at the time. I was absolutely astounded by that massive disconnect that exists between us in the refugee camp and the way that we are perceived elsewhere. And I'm not just talking about media and CNN and Fox News. I'm not talking about mainstream academia either. I'm also talking about people who perceive themselves to be in a better position to understand us. Even within our own solidarity movement, there was this massive disconnect. And for me, the references of the refugee camp were the refugees, their daily struggles, the memories of the Nakba, the fighters. My father was a freedom fighter. In fact, I wrote a book called My Father Was a Freedom Fighter. I lived by the martyrs' graveyard where all the kids who used to be killed in the Intifada were buried there. I went to Al-Masjid al-Kabir, the great mosque of Nusayrat, later renamed Al-Qassam Mosque, and later bombed by the Israeli army in 2014. 2 people were killed of my neighbors, and it's being rebuilt again. These were the references in my mind when I found myself kind of having to engage a community that is supposedly pro-Palestine. It was a bit confusing to me. To give you an example, I went to study at the University of Washington, and I attended this pro-Palestine meeting in Seattle. And one of the people suggested that we need to worry about the trauma that is experienced by Israeli soldiers in the occupied territories. They are victims too, that person said. Everybody nodded. And then they start talking about the Israeli trauma in victimizing the Palestinians. And nobody talked about the Palestinians. And then I found myself in this very surreal, strange world in which our narrative as a Palestinian people is marginalized, intentionally hidden, as if we are a liability to ourselves. We can't speak for ourselves, because we are going to say all sorts of things that are not consistent with what you should think of us. We are even marginalized in conferences sometimes that advocate Palestinian rights. Oftentimes, we find ourselves as sidekicks to someone else who is more equipped to tell our story because he is closer to the mindset. He can speak better to the mainstream, and therefore we are constantly finding ourselves kind of bashfully fighting for space to tell our own story. You see, so we always need a buffer. We always need a buffer. And that is really not at all what life in Palestine is like. In reality, our references, our frame of reference, our discourses, our daily stories, our struggles are not what is being portrayed of us. We are neither victims, and by victims I mean perpetual victims, as people who are embracing the role of the victims, or just really constantly just being for international aid and food and medicine and that sort of thing. We've never actually adopted the role of the victim in our narrative. So if you understand an original Palestinian narrative, we do not write ourselves as victims. We do not assign that role to ourselves, and certainly we are not terrorists. And that is not even part of any discourse that we discuss amongst ourselves. But here we are, finding ourselves oftentimes having to navigate the distance between the terrorist and the victim. This is why you have these things as, you know, you have even Palestinians finding themselves standing in Western platforms having to say, we are not all Hamas. We haven't all elected Hamas, as if Hamas is some sort of an alien invasion that came from outer space imposed on the Palestinian people. Not in any way an organic evolution of Palestinian culture. Agree with it or disagree with it, this is your right. But that's not the issue. The fact is, Hamas is part of our society. As much as Fatah, as much as the Jabha Sha'biyya, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, as much as everyone else. This is who we are, and this is our society. And you have to understand this according to our own terms. We don't need to adopt our discourse. Maybe we can use language that is relatable to you. But the discourse itself, the heart of the discourse, the core of the discourse is ours. And only us can determine its direction, its values, and its aspirations. So, this is all just to justify to you why I did not choose a quote by Ramzy and Said, but rather that of Ali Abu Ghassi. So let me just read to you just a few passages of Ali Abu Ghassi. Before I tell you, Ali was a prisoner in Syria. During the uprising turn, civil war turn, regional war, Ali found himself free. He was freed. He ran away to Lebanon. The Lebanese caught him, shipped him to Egypt. The Egyptians did not want him, so he ran away and he got smuggled under the border, the Rafah border, into Gaza, and he found himself there without his family. So the whole idea of why Yusuf connected me with Ali, the idea was maybe I can write an article. I have several articles that are published in various papers, and maybe we can write his story, and maybe somewhere, someone, somewhere can actually locate Ali's family. That was the idea. But the story ended up being just way too fascinating that we decided to actually incorporate it into the book. Now, Ali was a sniper in Lebanon, and he fought the Israelis, and he fought the Israelis in Lebanon, he fought them in Jordan. He actually went to Iraq at one point to fight the Americans. And I said, what were you doing in Iraq? I mean, this is not our fight. He went to al-Qasrain, like when the war first started. Ali was there. He went with volunteers to the Syria border, went to fight in Iraq, and he said, we are Arabs, that's what we do. We fight for each other. And it just puzzled me that Ali from Gaza found himself all the way south of Basra at the Kuwait border trying to stop the Americans from coming in. And I told him, tell me about how did you learn to be a sniper? He said, oh, I learned from the best. There was a young man, he was far younger than all of us. But he was very, very good. I said, what's his name? He said, Muhammad Baroud. Really? I mean, tell me more about Muhammad Baroud. He said, well, he was from Gaza, from the Nusayr. I said, are you talking about my dad? So it turned out that my dad was a badass back in the day, and he taught Ali Abu Ghassi how to be a sniper. Talking about positionality in academia, right? So suddenly, you're trying to be this kind of like, tell me your story, I'm not gonna get too involved, and suddenly you find your father just jammed right in there, and he's kind of responsible for much of the mess that Ali has done. So when I decided to tell Ali's story, and here's the thing that's really, really interesting about how ordinary people tell their stories. Whether in journalism, which is kind of like short-term understanding of what's happening today within the context of last week and last month and maybe 2 years ago, or academia that kind of looks at a more expansive discourse. So when I approached this, I kind of was thinking of the same markers, one state, two states, refugees, Nakba, 1967, before, after, the first intifada, second intifada, and trying to kind of like fit the people in these little fragments, in the name of I'm telling your story. But it turned out that they do not subscribe to any of that. To any of that. I spoke to, I'm getting you excited about Ali's quote. I will read the quote in a second. I spoke to this lady, her name is Marwan al-Assar. Marwan was my neighbor actually back in Gaza. She lost two loved ones that really lit a mark at her heart. One was Salim, her brother, and the other was Kamal, her son. Kamal died as a result of torture by the Israeli army during the First Intifada. Salim disappeared in 1956, a long time ago. He was running away from the Israelis. We think that he might have been killed and buried in some orchard somewhere as he tried to escape Gaza. Whenever Marwan speaks about them, she mixes between their names. Now I thought, this is really interesting. Marwan is mixing up big time between dates. 1956, 1967, she keeps, as like, Marwan, we were talking about the 1967 war. Why are you reverting back to 1956? It's like, Yamma wallah ana kbiri unasi. I'm old and I keep forgetting. I was like, did we make the right choice of talking to Marwan in the first place? But then, when it came to her family, her personal memories, from the very early, one of the early memories of riding on a donkey along with Salim, who died in 56, yeah, and escaping with their families the Nakba, and the stories that they used to tell and the details of these stories. She knew what her kids were wearing when the Israelis came the first time and they broke down the house and they took Kamal out. Yes, ya Khalto. He was wearing a white shirt with, and I want details, and she knew all the details. But when it came to other areas, she was really mixing things up. And when it came to differentiating between two people who died decades apart, she kept mixing up. And I thought, it is because grief tends to come from the same part of the memory. Because for Marwan, the loss of Salim, the loss of Kamal, the loss of the homeland, the loss of hope, and the resurrection of hope, it's all part of the same part of her brain that makes her who she is, and the fact that she carried on after all these years, raising her grandsons all on her own. Now I'm thinking, Kamal cannot read or write. She can't. But in my opinion, like numerous Palestinian women that you never hear of, their names are not indexed in any book. They are not part of any discussion. Their quotes are hardly quotable, yet in reality, they are the essence, the heart and mind of Palestine and the Palestinian people. They exemplify the true empowerment of Palestinian women, not as a separate discourse, not as a separate political discussion or entity, but rather as part and parcel of a larger discourse, and that is the discourse of the Palestinian people. Now that you are all excited about Ali Abu Ghassid's quote, this is a letter, a long letter I wrote on his behalf to his daughter Hiba, his eldest daughter, hoping that maybe one day he will find his family. Hiba, I tried my hardest to shield you from all harm. You saw me in my heyday as a fighter in my military fatigue, but also as a broken man who worked under the burning sun as a manual laborer. My pocket hid the secret of a fake name on a false identity card. All the while, I was fighting for you. And I really thought we could win. I long fantasized about our final trip to Palestine once it would be liberated. I imagined you wearing the thobe I brought you from Burj al-Barajne, embroidered with the colors of the flag. I imagined Ahmed as a fighter too. Wearing a khaki outfit adorned with a black and white kufiya, in that fantasy I was always old, but strong enough to remember everything clearly. I would guide you through our village in Wadi Shalalha in Birzeit. This is where your grandfather Aish fell in love with your grandmother Hamdah, I would say, and he would smile and insist I tell you the story all over again. And you needed to know every detail, from the color of the sky to the flowers that bloomed. He was a poor man too, a Bedouin, like me. And like me, he was short, dark, and wrinkled. But unlike me, he had little patience. His life was always hard. And when he was forced out of his village, that small piece of land we called At-Tur al-Abyad, he lost his mind. He lost everything. I can assure you that Ali Abu Ghasib right now is joining the Great March of Return at the Gaza border. I'm sure of it. In fact, when he went back to Gaza, that was just before 2014, he decided he was going to join the resistance. So he goes to the Hamas fighter near Beit Hanun, and he volunteers his services. He's an old man, he's wounded, he can barely walk. And I said, oh, okay, so you went there and you asked them. He said, yes, I want to die with a rifle in my hand. And I said, what did they say? He said, well, they bought me a kebab sandwich. And they sent me home. They said, you have fought for us, now it's our turn. I think ultimately that is really what the Palestinian discourse is. Ultimately, it's Marwan al-Assar, is Ali Abu Ghasib, are the kids demonstrating. And just imagine this, and I know that I might have exceeded my time by now, but 70 years, generation after generation, the Zionists thought the whole thing is going to be sorted out. We just need the right peace agreement, the right proposal, the right men, who would agree to do business with us. Notice how Americans always ask, who is the great man, or who is the strong Palestinian we can speak with? They're always asking for a single person to sort out everything. Yet 70 years later, how many generations is that? Generations about 26 years, 27 years? I don't know, several generations. Yet, you have children right now who have their ancestors lived in villages that have been destroyed, yet they are still standing there, aware of who they are, aware of where their families came from, aware of have the kind of political aspirations of wanting to go regardless of whether that is feasible, not feasible. That's a whole different discussion. It doesn't matter. Knowing who you are after all of these years and fighting for it and dying for it, that is the Palestinian discourse. I'm going to finish with that. I just want you to remember this. Let the Palestinian people be the core of our understanding of Palestine. Any discourse that lacks that centrality of the Palestinian people is not deserving of being a Palestinian discourse. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Baroud. Finally, we welcome Mr. Frank Barat, who will speak on Palestine as a universal struggle for freedom.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Last speaker of the day, so I'm very glad you all, still around. I can only see one person speaking in the room, which is pretty good, and I won't mention who. I won't go over the 35 minutes that I'll be short. So I'm very happy to have been invited to speak at this conference. It's really an honor to share, this place and this panel with so many speakers, some of whom have really influenced and have played an integral part into shaping my view of the Palestine question and into my activism in general. So I really want to thank again Linda, Riyad, Fadi, the organizers, the interpreters, and of course Dr. Sami Al-Arian for organizing this conference. So I've been asked to talk about global Palestine, and I'm very happy about this as well, because that's an issue I'm deeply involved in and connected in, interested in, and an issue that I'm very often thinking about, sometimes in an optimistic way, sometimes not. So I think the Q&A after the questions will be very interesting as well, because I think as speakers we have to learn as much from you than you have to learn from us. So the term global Palestine has been for a few years now an integral part of the dictionary, right, the lingo of the Palestine solidarity movement. But I'm not entirely sure we all agree on what we mean by global Palestine. I'm not sure what we mean, what definition. I'm not sure we agree on the definition of the term. So what do we mean by global Palestine? So in my opinion, there's more than one layer associated with the term. And it's important to focus on all the layers, not on one of them. So I think we all agree that what's happening in Palestine has repercussions all around the globe, and that what takes place in this sort of tiny piece of land has a very global impact. What's also evident is that many political actors are often involved in shaping the present and the future of this land, but that very often the Palestinians are not part of the equation. They're not at the table when it's time to discuss their own future. As we've recently seen with the Trump administration, as well as Netanyahu and the Israeli government, they can take unilateral actions, radical actions on issues such as Jerusalem, such as the Golan Heights, sort of breaking a very long historical, even if fragile, consensus, with the Palestinians pretty much only left with their eyes to cry. Also, what is wrongly referred to as the international community, when actually we mean Western governments, rarely react to such actions with more than statements or soft condemnations. When in fact Europe has very concrete ways to influence the discussion and make Israel take responsibility for its actions. So what's happening on the ground, which is really the continuity of the greater Israel project that the Zionist movement had in mind at its inception, the ongoing settler colonial project of Israel, the annexation of the whole of what's left of Palestine, we know has a deep root and impact in international politics. But what's also clear, and it's been more obvious in the last few years, is that these political decisions and actions are seen by many around the world as an ongoing injustice, and these actions infuriate and sometimes radicalize people in various ways. If we have a brief look at Netanyahu's recent re-election, and I'm not even talking about the fact that he got re-elected while facing very serious corruption charges, we can see that on the ground the problem the Palestinians are facing is huge. The fact that during the election, at no time at all, the disenfranchisement of 6 million people, all under Israel's control, but that cannot vote, came into the equation. The Palestinians from the occupied territories or from 48 were simply absent, transparent during the whole process of the election. And in fact, that's what I'd like to focus on in the next 15 minutes. The sort of duality of despair on the ground, where it seems that things are getting worse and worse, and the politics of hope that seems to happen at an international level. I'm not saying, obviously, there's no hope on the ground, and the Great March of Return, for example, is an incredible example of smooth resistance and hope. But I think when we talk about global Palestine, we have to also talk about global Israel, because I think we are facing two types of globalizations that, even though totally different, can already be separated from one another. So on one side, we have global Israel. Israel is exporting its knowledge of urban warfare and control and security all over the world. Israel is very proud, using Gaza and the West Bank as a sort of laboratory in its experiment. They're supplying arms to various police around the world, including the Brazilian police in the favelas. They're providing experts on how to build walls, everywhere, wherever one wall is needed. And Israel is all on paper, all but on paper, part of Europe, with all the advantages it entails in terms of agreements, research agreements, and the rest. Also, something that is very real and very felt, at least I think in Western societies, and something we, as people that live in the West, have to be very realistic on, is that the Israelization of our societies is very real. Recently, when terrorist acts were committed in France, in Paris, I was listening to France Inter, one of the main radio stations, and every day you could be sure you had an Israeli expert on the radio with the commentator asking him, "You guys know how to deal with this type of terrorism. How do you do it?" So I think it's very scary because, when we say, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, we also laugh about it. But in fact, Israel might be a democracy if we accept this sort of new neoliberal definition of democracy throughout the world. Israel may actually be a model for what democracies are going to look like in the future. A new form of democracy where the demos, the people, won't have any power anymore. And for example, Professor Pape, unfortunately had to leave, he reminded us today how important language and semantics have been in the history of the Palestine question. And while we as activists, as Ilan mentioned, have to use a new dictionary, it's important also to keep in mind that Israel is also producing its own sort of authoritarian new dictionary that is more and more adopted, at least by Western governments. So the global Israel movement is what we call sort of international, reactionary, and fascist globalism. With the Trump, the Sisi, the Orban, Bolsonaro, Duterte, Bin Salman of this world. And Israel has always been part of this movement. Israel has never been in its history on the wave of social justice and hope. On the other hand, we have global Palestine, with the growth of Palestine solidarity movements around the globe, with the growth of the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, the intersectional links made with the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, the rise of progressive voices inside the US Congress that are slowly shifting the conversation in the US to the left, and the vibrant activism in Europe and US campuses. And I think global Palestine is really sort of about another world, and can apply to various social justice movements that are happening at an international level. And when I think about Palestine in a global way, I think that Palestine is a window towards a better world. It's also a window on what's wrong with the world right now, but it can be a window of possibilities of what we together can make to not only free Palestine, but I think free ourselves also from various forms of oppressions. So in this regard, the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, the BDS movement, has been key and very important in making the links between Israel's oppression and other states and institutions' support for this oppression. Because I think, before the BDS movement, at various conferences, people come to you and ask, "Look, I'm Italian, I'm great, what can I do? I'm not Muslim, I'm not Jew, I'm not Palestinian or Israeli, what can I do about Palestine? Now with the BDS movement, when you explain that your government is, if Israel is the thief, your government is the one providing the car, when the bank has been sort of robbed or something, or the government is providing the diplomatic impunity. So you have to do something, this is part of a global movement and you have a role to play. So I think the BDS movement has been key in sort of rejuvenating the movement and re-empowering people that you can do something. It's about the world we live in general. And I see BDS as politics of empowerment, really. If I had to focus right now on one aspect of BDS, I think for practical reasons, it would be the boycott. Sanctions will come later, inshallah, and they depend on states and institutions. Divestment is key, and it's happened all over the world, but it's also about financial power more than anything. And I think in terms of boycott, what has hurt Israel the most in recent years is the cultural and academic boycott. The fact that so many well-known artists and academics are now clearly taking a stand and refusing to play or go to Israel is massive, because it also affects the consciences of the people on the ground. Also, the artists are very important for the movement, for ourselves, and as Dr. Rawan mentioned this morning, the artists are the ones that can allow us to imagine what might be possible. They are the ones that can free our imagination. And they've been key in past struggles. Obviously, you can think about Emory Douglas for the Black Panther Party, Najir Ali for Palestine, and they will be in the future as well. So when they take a stand and they say, we are artists, but before anything, we are citizens, and what we're seeing in Palestine, is wrong, and we'll take a stand against it, is very important. So this movement, sort of contrary to the first one, is a social, intersectional, internationalist, and inclusive form of globalism. Word. I think the biggest problem, the first global movement of the fascist, racist, and authoritarian one, the Trump and Netanyahu, is facing is quite simple. Despite the huge disparity of financial, military, and political power, the Palestinians are staying. Call it sumud, call it resistance, call it whatever you want. It's pretty clear, it's their home, their land, they're not moving. And I think that the powers realize that, and they are pretty desperate, and that's why I think the Israeli society and the Israeli government is what someone, I can't remember, said Israel, we created a monster. But if you take, a lion that is scared, it's going to do lots of crazy things. A lion in a cage, when he feels he's desperate, he's going to he's going to do even more crazy things than before. I think Israel is at this point. They do feel, despite their bragging about the opposite, that they are very being cornered. And I think that's why, as again, Rabab said before, it's probably going to have to get worse before it gets better. But it might be soon that it's going to get better, again, inshallah. So, the second movement, the progressive, inclusive one, our movement, hopefully, is facing the challenge of time and resilience, I guess. How long is it going to take for things to not only get better away from Palestine, but for actually positive changes to happen on the ground? And I think that's also a huge question, and one we shouldn't sort of underestimate. I personally know, and I'm sure we all know, so many activists and even Palestinians on the ground that have sort of had enough, and that have, understandably, have sort of stopped resisting. And again, I think as international, and I sometimes hear that, I go to Ramallah, it seems that people are happy, they're like, okay, they've taken a few checkpoints out, that's the best we can expect for, and now we're partying and stuff. And people from the outside criticizing what some people in Ramallah are doing is very problematic, because I remember my friend Saeed Habouijleh talking to me about the demonstrations in Nablus, the peaceful demonstrations, and that always ended with Israeli snipers shooting people, torturing people. jailing people. So after a while, when you've seen your dad go to jail, when you've been tortured by Israel, when you've seen your house destroyed 5 times, and it's been 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, you can understand where someone would say, look, the checkpoint doesn't work anymore, halas, I'm okay with that. So that's something we have not to be shy about, and we have to talk about. I think that's pretty much finished. So just to wrap up, because I think it's, again, I want to leave as much time to the questions as well. We also have to, again, I think Ramzy was mentioning that sometimes the media talks about, when the media talks about history, they talk about yesterday and maybe the week before. But we have to remember as a movement, as activists, that history goes back 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And if history has taught us something, in the case of South Africa and many other national liberation movements, is that at the end of the day, people's power win and oppression falls. And I think right now, we have to embrace the struggle, and we have to rejoice on sort of small victories and on this pretty exhilarating journey that we're all together in, right? It's not very often in these sort of societies, individualistic societies, that you can be hand in hand with a woman, a man, a Palestinian, a Jew, a Muslim, a French guy, an Italian guy, and work together on the same goal towards the same future. So I think this journey that we all have sort of embarked upon, and hopefully we lead the Palestinians and ourselves to freedom, is something we should really embrace and celebrate. Shukran.
Thank you, Mr. Barat. So we have, I received a message that we should work to end on time as much as possible. So I'd like to shortly open the floor for questions and answers from the audience. Please keep your questions and comments. I kindly ask to no more than 90 seconds for the sake of really maximizing the time and to allow as many questions as possible. So are we microphones? Okay. So we'll open the floor now for questions.
Benim sorum Sözcüler Barıt'ı olacak. Çok güzel bir şeyden bahsetti.
We're in need of translation for this particular question. So if anyone is willing to volunteer? Oh, thank you. Okay.
Evet, kısa bir soru. Çok haklı bir şeyden bahsetti. Bir eksik bıraktığımız bir alanda üstelik mücadeleleri dünyada pek çok vicdan sahibi insanlar karşı çıkıyorlar.
She mentions that you addressed well points and that there's some things that you've missed.
Özellikle sanatçıları yanımıza almamız istedi, çok doğru. Ama bu mücadeleleri veren yani dünyada belli bir zaman sonra bedel ödemek zorunda kalıyoruz.
You said that it's important to get artists on our side, but what happens in time is they have to face the consequences.
Yani mesela yakın bir geçmişte Hannah Arendt'in başına gelenler, Baroud'un başına gelenler.
What happened with the names that she mentioned?
Belki bu tür çıkışlar yapan insanları da desteklemek üzere, onları yalnız bırakmamak üzere bir çalışmanın olması gerekir mi? Onu sormak istiyorum. Teşekkür ederim.
There should be things where we can support them as well and not leave these names mentioned alone.
Okay, thank you. We'll take some more questions. Okay, I'll go in order. Thank you. Okay, gentleman in the straight.
So actually my question is for Ramzy first. You said that the fight for Palestine is not just for Palestine, it's for all the Arabs, for the opposite. So what I want to ask, why the world keep ignoring this? Like I'm from Egypt. Last thing I heard, a party was coming from for the Congress, from the protesters, and what the guys in the parliament say, you should follow what the president Sisi said about the Islam. And they actually won't talk about this. That's like my question, why they keep ignoring us and they keep opening other things that we are not talking about. Thank you.
Gentleman in the gray, and then you're next.
Thank you very much. Directly, my question to Dr. Loubna. You mentioned a lot about the role of youth during the history of the Palestinian movement. But I was actually waiting to listen what is the role now for the youth now. So my question is, what is the role of the youth in the light of two major trends now? The first one is the decentralized and horizontalized and leaderless movement of youth, which are derived from the Twitter and Facebook, etc., and the declined belief in the political parties as well as political organization. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me the words. My name is Ismail Tezan. I've lived in the UK for 30 years, and I'm currently living in Istanbul for 3 years now. We all know the BDS is feared by the occupational force, and they clamp down on object against its fighters. But when I speak to tradesmen about boycotting and the consumers, I get mixed comments, such as the consumer says, we boycott one product and we're using another product. The tradesman argues, we can't find the same type of product. Another point of view for my household is we want to boycott one product, but then we find our washing machine is this, and then we try to dilute ourselves from boycotting that, and we can't find the same quality. So we as a public, my question is this, we need a project and a plan, and what can we do more kind of statistically to actually combat this BDS, because we know from the past as well, from all of these kind of zulm that is going in the world, that this is the biggest fear, BDS, the economy crisis. So inshallah one of the speakers can answer my question.
Thank you. Our sister in the pink.
My name is Sarah Hassan. I have a question for Dr. Loubna Qutami. Do you think that the PYM would have been successful, or relatively successful, if the Arab Spring had not interrupted it?
In the third row from the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Islah. I would like to connect the different lectures from our friends. Rawan said produce, advocate, and network. I think I made that word. But I would like to say about globalizing the struggle of Palestine and global Palestine, as Frank, my dear friend Frank Barat said. I have a friend, his name is Mike Collins. He wrote a book called Global Palestine. And it's really amazing. I met Mike Collins like 17 years ago, and I forgot that I met him actually. Helped a lot. And by meeting and introducing him to the camps and many other things, he ended up like I contributed a lot to the production of this book, Global Palestine. And this is the issue of the power of networking and bringing people together. Just giving you an example, another example, and I'm not going to talk too long, but because I think it's very important. I had another friend, his name Michael Kennedy. He came to Palestine and he said, please take me to Al-Far'a prison. Al-Far'a prison, I was in that prison and I was tortured like 3-4 times. And he said, I don't know how if I want to take you because I haven't been there in 23 years. I don't know how would I feel. But then he pressured me, and I took him to Al-Far'a prison. And I had flashback, and he started writing and recording notes and taking photos, and taking video. And it ended up the first master's degree, he was in AUC in Cairo, produced on Al-Farah prison. And now he's doing his PhD, he's an anthropologist, on Al-Farah prison. On Al-Farah prison. So this brings me to the issue of the last thing, is youth. Our youth are empowering the people's voices. We have youth in our universities who are actually in the struggle, who go through the checkpoints, who go to jail, who get shot and tortured or maimed or killed or assassinated. And their voices, as our friend Ramzy put, are not the ones that are heard. And these voices that should be heard in poetry, in film, and that's what's amazing about your work, Rawan. I'm overwhelmed actually by the totality of this amazing panel. And I just wanted to bring this power of networking, bringing all these voices into the world, but in a very powerful way. And this, I really thank you. I just wanted to say this. Thank you.
Thank you. John, second row.
Thank you, Ron from Jordan. My question is to Rawan, Ramzy, and Frank maybe for the media. So yesterday somebody commented on the fact that we need a Palestinian Mandela, and then Mr. Mandela responded with the fact that the ANC could not have defeated apartheid without the sacrifices of so many people that we don't know. And this reminds us of the saying that history is made by the millions of unknown and nameless people. What can you do with your work to shed light on the activities and the activisms of many citizens of different countries inside and outside Palestine who are doing things to support the cause, who can become small icons for other youth and other people to follow, and thus creating the feeling that we are not helpless, that people have done this here and others have done this there, and this creates the inspiration for the youth who are looking at the cause and seeing not much they can do.
And then in the back,
Salam to all. I would like to comment on what Mr. Baroud said about the necessity of I think to be the leaders and to be the leaders of their own struggle and their own narrative. Mostly in the West, within the solidarity movement, you have plenty of speakers who are not actually Palestinian, who are their voices are let's say seen as relevant, much more than Palestinian voices. I mean, could be European, could be Israelis, could be Jews, American Jews, and maybe it's a kind of let's say racism, or I don't know, maybe Eurocentrism, something like that. I mean, related. And what can we do to push forward the Palestinian voices? This is my first question. And allow me, Mr. Baroud, to disagree on the word you used about the Gaza border. If you talk about the Israeli fence, the border, we had that discussion about the wording with Professor Pape. And secondly, to Mr. Barat and to all of us, I mean, as a non-Palestinian, as French activist, I mean, it's as important for me to push for the Palestinian message as for them, because it's my duty as a European taxpayer. At least, if I don't do that, I'm complicit. I don't want to I don't want my money to be used against the Palestinians, because I would be the next on the list. This is first point. And secondly, I don't want to allow neither the Israeli government through the embassy, nor my own government, to silence my voice or to obstruct or to limit my democratic rights and my democratic liberty, right to defend and to push forward the Palestinian narrative. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. We'll allow our panelists to respond. It was a long list of questions, and we'll see if we can take another round if possible. But yes.
My neighbor from Gaza is over there and he wants to ask a question.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Second row from them.
يعني إذا ممكن سأحاول الحديث بالعربية مرة أخرى. عندي سؤالين بستغل الدكتور رمزي إنه أعطانا فرصة للسؤال. الموضوع الأول برجع إنه اليوم قد إيه بتغير أدوات العمل الفلسطيني بالنسبة لك ما بين جوا لما كنت بالمخيم وبالأرض المحتلة وأنت لازلت متابع كيف الناس بتشتغل جوا وما بين كيف بتشتغل برا اليوم. أنا بالنسبة لي الأمر صعب يعني بسألك سؤال شخصي. قد ايه كان الامر صعب في الاربع سنين اللي قضيتهم بالخارج؟ السؤال الثاني للدكتوره اصلاح حول الموضوع النسوي الفلسطيني، في بلحظ او هل هناك انفصال بين الحركه النسويه الفلسطينيه اللي هي دائما موضع البحث وموضع الحديث وبين المراه الفلسطينيه والرائحه اليوميه؟ وتطور انماط نشاطها او فعلها للمراه الفلسطينيه على عكس الحركه النسويه الفلسطينيه اللي تراجعت زي ما احنا عارفين بالسنوات الاخيره. بس فينا نشوف مثلا مئات الطالبات والشابات هن عماد الحراك بال 48 لمقاطعه انتخابات الكنيست او عشرات خلينا نقول بال 48. الحراك التضامن مع اضراب الاسرى في الفتيات بتقدم محتل مواقع محترمه جدا وكويسه. في عندنا بحاله غزه ومسيرات العوده كان آلاف النساء قاعدات بشاركن والنساء تقليديات ما بيمثل صورة الحركة النسوية الفلسطينية بالمعنى التحرري الليبرالي كذا. فهنا بنشوف انه في مينستريم حاطط معايير لايش لازم تكون المرأة الفلسطينية وما بين المرأة الفلسطينية فعليا. المرأة الفلسطينية وين بتنشط سياسيا وين بتتقدم وين كذا وين واقعها مش مهم. المهم هل الحركة النسوية الفلسطينية تقدمت؟ لا او انا بالنسبة لي مش مهم يعني. هنا السؤال هل باتت الحركة النسوية الفلسطينية هي معيق للجهد النسوي لجهد المرأة الفلسطينية أو قيمتها أو ستارة بتحجب عنها المرأة؟ شكرا.
Try to offer a few minutes, maybe 4 or 5 minutes for each panelist to address the questions.
Okay, so I can start by the last question concerning the women's movement. What I try to detail is about the why the demobilization, why women's movements are not anymore in direct contact with the constituencies or the women at the grassroots. So yes, there is the organization supposed to represent women in general are in crisis, and their organizations are facing lots of problems, whether because of their anxieties or whatever. And I try to shed some light on the Islamist women that as a movement they are emerging, but they are also facing a problem not to be able to represent all women. So they are representing a category or a group of women, and they are more successful in the sense that they link their movement with the question of the national struggle. And I have just few words about the boycott. The boycott, before it is considered as an efficient economic tool to make Israeli economy lose, more importantly is to create the culture of boycott. It doesn't matter if you boycott this product and you need to buy another product or whatever. But it is important to have in mind the culture of boycott, that this entity should be punished, in a way or another. Thank
you. So thank you for the questions. I'll answer the question about the role of youth now, and specifically the question of decentralized movement of youth and decline in belief in the political parties. I think I maybe didn't, foreground my bias and my orientation in the talk. I recognize that the main role for youth today, whether they're inside Palestine or outside, is in political activity, is a decentralized role. But I did try to tend to the question of an escalation of political activity at all levels. So whether they're prisoners or cultural workers or writers or academics or people going out into the streets in protests, or people in the far exile waging boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign. I think that there is an escalation of youth political activity that we haven't seen in the aftermath of the Oslo Accords period. And it's not just about youth, it's about the growing solidarity movement globally, it's about Palestinian communities globally engaging in all of these different forms. But I really am someone who maybe is nervous about the conflation of activism with political organization. And I know that because of the Palestinian political situation today, we are revering and we're celebrating the expansion of activism that's happening globally. And I think that this is important. It's creating consciousness, it's creating more global allies, it's creating more resources and opportunities, it's putting pressure on Israel, it's exposing them, and it's forcing them to concede to someone or something. But the question is, in the absence of political organization within Palestinian national politics, I don't know who it is that one day when the moment is ripe with possibility, the Israelis are going to be forced to concede to. How are the Palestinians building their decolonial trajectory? I have an understanding of how Palestinians and their allies are building an anti-colonial activism on a global level, but the national strategy, which the earlier panel spoke to today, it's not something we can evade. We can't just evade it by celebrating, an Arab idol star who's singing about Palestinian blood. I'm being facetious, by the way. Okay, so the second thing that I want to talk about in terms of the decline of the belief in political parties, it's true. Palestinian youth are developing more of an overt expression of antagonism to the political parties. I find this to be very dangerous because simultaneously in their critique of the political parties and the political establishment, what they're also critiquing is institutional forms of politics. And so they're negating an entire rich legacy and history that we have as Palestinians in our anti-colonial struggle that we can learn from by saying, we don't want a political party, we don't want organizations, and kind of privileging the more individual forms of activism over community accountable forms of politics. The last question about, do I think the PYM would have been successful if the Arab uprisings didn't happen? I don't know, it's a very complicated and difficult question. I would say that I don't know what successful is or isn't, and I think that PYM's experience was a reflection of the Palestinian condition during those years. But I think one thing that moment did teach me as a member who was in the PYM is that there is something particular about a community of people whose political strategies and resources and ideas and thoughts and trajectories are interrupted by regional and global changes in power, unpredictable things, unpredictable variables that we didn't see. And that actually helped me have a lot more empathy for former generations, including my grandfather's generation. It helped me understand the Palestinian condition across time and place, that there are things that we can plan for that in the absence of having our own landmass, we cannot totally account for. In many ways, we're at the whims of different players. And the second thing that I would say is that I think it was a moment that reflected that we need a particular calculus of things to come together. A regional moment that's rife with possibility, preparedness of our organizations, a revolutionary consciousness within our community, a strategy, resources, alliances, and we just didn't have that calculus in that moment. So successful or not, whether we failed or not, I'm not sure, but I think that
I think so long as we could take the lessons away from the PYM experience and find a way to institutionally pass them down to new generations, that for me is what's important for me.
Thank you very much. We are really lucky to be in this conference. It doesn't happen every day to have all this discussion. It's also difficult to absorb everything and then comment on it. I have three quick points. The first is, since Loubna and Helga mentioned Consultancy yesterday and today, I would love to mention Najib Nassar and Sadaj Bahai. As Dr. Hani in the session before the lunch said, 102 years of struggle, I think even more. Najib Nassar started in 1909 talking about Zionism, and his wife Sadaj Bahai was the first Palestinian woman from Acre that the British mandate got her into the prison for 1.5 years. So we have the role models. Maybe the stories are not well circulated enough. They are documented, but maybe not in an audiovisual capacity. And this brings me to Rami's question, how we can document all of those things. We cannot depend on professional media people and ask them to document these things. I think every one of us is responsible. I'm very sad when I meet people who did not document their own family stories, their grandparents, their people. You can document in a professional, passionate way. Now with the technology, you can document things, audio and video, you can at least document the things. Oral history projects have been going on since the 70s. A lot of projects, AUB now have 3,000 hours of audiovisual material about Palestine. Birzeit University started from the 70s, but also we are losing a lot of things because we as people are not documenting things enough. And later we'll find incredible smart people like Ramzy to transfer those stories into real international capacity stories and audiovisual things. So I think my advice is knowledge is very important in these days. Every one of us can do something to empower what can happen, plus be professional and passionate, and we can reach the sky. Thank you.
I wanted to be professional as well and keep track of all my comments. Now I can't read my own handwriting. But I'll do my best. Regarding BDS, I think we have to think of BDS more than just a practical mechanism to hold Israel accountable. Because there's always the question as well, no matter how much money Israel is going to lose, the Americans will give it to them on the other hand, so what's the point? I think it's important that we know that one of the main Israeli endeavors, political endeavors from the very, very beginning was to legitimize Israel as an actual state, as a member of the international community, and so forth. And they have failed. This is why, when Benjamin Netanyahu comes and says, BDS is trying to delegitimize Israel, don't say no. Yes, that's precisely what we are trying to do. But we are not trying to delegitimize Israel because we are picking on Israel. We are trying to delegitimize Israel because Israel is an apartheid, secular colonial regime that deserves to be marginalized, that deserves to be isolated, that deserves to be delegitimized. Now, how does this relate to hummus? The way it relates to hummus is that when you go to a grocery store and you look at the various products and you realize that this is an Israeli product and you make the conscious decision. Now, of course, I am, again, being facetious, and I don't mean hummus as hummus, I mean that as a representation of everything else. When you make that decision that I will not buy this Israeli product, you are engaging with the Palestinian people. You are no longer someone who is sitting, watching TV, saying that there is nothing we can do about it, or desperately trying to, how can an ordinary person in this country or that contribute to this? It's hopeless. It's been going on for 1,000 years. No, you can actually refrain from buying the Israeli hummus. And the moment you do that, you're engaging with our movement. Now, I think BDS is far more intellectual movement than it is actually a very practical boycott. Because what happens when BDS becomes the center of the conversation, we are finally having a conversation. Because you see, for so many years, they did not even acknowledge that we existed, let alone that we had a narrative, let alone that we require remedy of some kind. Now, they want to talk to us. Is there one major American university that did not engage with the issue of BDS? No. And regardless of the outcome, regardless of the resolution regarding BDS passes or doesn't pass, it doesn't matter, because we are having a conversation and we are finally at the center of this discussion, and we are finally creating alternatives until our people back at home go through this transition. We are going through this gap, this political gap. You can classify it in any way you want. It's not the end of the world from a historical point of view. Any national liberation movement went through such historical gaps. We're not the exception. But while that is being articulated, and it will be ultimately the Palestinian people who will make that decision, we are creating a global movement that is fighting Israel every street corner, every American, Canadian, Brazilian, African, Malaysian, Chinese city. We are there. We are there in the BDS, the Israel Apartheid Week. Hundreds of cities get involved, get engaged in the conversation. We protest, sometimes in our dozens, sometimes in our thousands, but we are out there. And BDS has created that momentum for us. This is why it's so very important that we engage with BDS with the right understanding of what BDS is actually trying to achieve. Regarding the solidarity in the Arab world, I think we have to be very careful here. We can't allow the cause of Palestine to be hijacked by this corrupt regime or that. We see what's happening right now with the so-called deal of the century, where you Arab sellouts trying to organize some sort of an arrangement with Kushner in some yacht somewhere, trying to sell the Palestinian cause. We have to be smarter than this to say, well, it is the cause of the Arabs, not in the sense that Saudi Arabia can decide what happens to my family in Gaza. We don't mean it that way. But solidarity is you. Solidarity is your people, my people. How many Egyptians died for Palestine? And I mean really, truly died for Palestine. How many Arab from Iraq to Yemen to Sudan? You know that the leader of the Arab army that was defending my village back in Beit Daras in Palestine in 1948 was from Sudan. And he was killed there. And he would not retreat, and he fought until the very end. How do I look at that the Sudani people and say, yeah, your solidarity means to me as much as solidarity coming from somewhere else? No, your solidarity is special. Because you are part and parcel of my culture, my history, my awareness, and my identity. And we cannot compromise on that. No matter what happens, CC or no CC, our faith is the same, our plight is the same, and our aspirations are the same. And the final point regarding how do you stay connected? I mean, you know, especially us refugees, I'm really not trying to prejudice against those who are not Palestinian refugees. We have this thing, you know, we call it al-waja, you know, that original pain that we have as Palestinians who lived in refugee camps, and we know what it feels like. We know what it is like. When there was a young man who was killed yesterday. He was a 16-year-old kid, this beautiful, handsome young man. You know, you see that, and what do we think of Arafat? Because we live right very close to each other. We had the martyrs' graveyard. How many children from our neighborhood and from the Nusayrat refugee camp were buried in the martyrs' graveyard? You see that you're not relating to this as a human being, you are related to this as your neighbor. Because we've seen what happened to Ra'id al-Muannis, we've seen what happened to Ala al-Jiyawi. These were our friends and neighbors, and they all went through this process. So no matter how far you are, you can always relate in a very intimate and a very personal level.
So I'll answer answer the first question about artists and something that I missed. I mean, I didn't really miss it, just enough time to really expand on this. But I totally agree that artists that are going to take a stand for Palestine have to be aware that they will face consequences. And we have, as activists, to create a safe space for them to engage in let's say, pro-Palestinian or pro-justice activism. And believe me, that's what we're doing, or we're trying to do, most of the time. I'll take a brief example. Ken Loach, for example, the British film director, who is one of the most well-known vocal supporter of Palestine. It didn't take a week or something to bring him on. He was one of the first jury members of the Russell Tribunal on Palestine. We took him to meetings with jurists, lawyers, activists, Palestinian filmmakers, and years after year, he got more and more radical because also he was more and more aware of what was happening on the ground, and he felt he had the knowledge to actually respond to pretty much any attack on the topic. So this is a very long process. And that's why sometimes people don't have to rush to conclusions too quickly, And you cannot ask, I mean, if you feel like an artist is on the verge of coming on board, you are going to talk with him about settlements, Because you have to be very pragmatic. If someone is nearly, coming on board and you straight away tell him you have to sign this boycott letter, Israel is an apartheid state, even if it's true, you're going to lose him or her. You need to do, it's an educational process. It needs to be very graduate, and it takes time. So about the boycott question, the fact that you boycott one product and then there's another one you need to boycott, and boycott is about education, and sometimes again, as activists, I can see this pamphlet with that, here is the product you have to boycott, and it's like pretty much every product that's in your house. So and this doesn't work. This is like someone is not aware of the conflict and stuff. If you take, you have to boycott your toothpaste, you have to boycott your shampoo, you have to boycott your hummus, you have to boycott avocado. You push them away. It's an educational tactic. You need again to take it one step at a time. But as Ramzy said, and I totally agree, as soon as you start boycotting, even if it's an avocado, even if it's an orange or something, you are embracing the Palestinian struggle. A brief example, one of my friends, who's not an activist at all, he's a translator, knows obviously that I support Palestine and stuff, and I think he sort of understands what's happening on the ground, but he's not really an activist. Recently he told me he got an offer to translate the El-Al website, the Israeli airline, the Israeli airline company. And he was very happy to tell me on WhatsApp, they asked me to translate Ally, and I refused. I mean, he didn't go further than that. He didn't explain to them why he refused. But I think it's always the first step. I mean, with your parents, your family and stuff, it's always, like, when I came back from Palestine for the first time, and I had, like, pictures, I had videos, my dad, even with the evidence, because of years also of brainwashing by the media, wouldn't believe me. He was like, this is science fiction. I said, no, this is real. That's the truth. You're pro-Palestinian. And it took a few years to what you're seeing at the sort of 8 p.m. news is not the truth, So again, it's a process. You can't rush it. And to finish, Rami, the question about, millions of people make history, not a Mandela or a Gandhi or something. I obviously totally agree, and Angela Davis, for example, is one who constantly say, like, this is not about me, this is about the hundreds of people that demonstrated to get me out of jail, etc. So it's very important, obviously, to tell, and Howard Zinn, the late US historian, wrote this magnificent book, People History of the United States of America. So it's key to tell the story of these people. And actually, I mean, I'm not Howard Zinn or anything, but I'm making a documentary right now about the Palestinian solidarity movement to show all these people that are involved, whether they're in Italy, in the US, in South Africa, with someone that Dr. Al-Arian knows very well, his son Ali. Yeah. So thank you.
Dr. Sami for supplemental appreciation.
Thank you very much. This has been a very stimulating, great panel, which I enjoyed very much. Indeed, Palestine
is a global struggle. It has a role for women and men and youth, and it's a global struggle, has media aspect, political, legal, and all. When Ramzy was mentioning in his comments, came to me that after the 1948 Nakba, my father was fighting and he was injured and he didn't know what happened to his brother who went north fighting. And it took him about a year and a half trying to find out what happened to him because he had no idea what happened to him. So he went from country to country asking people. Finally, he was able to locate where he died in battle. And next to him was a Bosnian and a Yemeni. All three died together in May of 1948, or July 1948. At any rate, I want to thank Islah, Loubna, Rawan, Ramzy, and Frank for a great panel. Thank you very much. Very well, that concludes today's sessions. Tomorrow will be our third and final day. We'll start at 9:30, and we will start with the panel on exploring liberation theology in the Palestinian struggle from Jewish, Christian, and Islamic perspective, followed by a session on the political, legal, and international perspectives of Palestine. And finally, the last session will be on challenges and responses. So I hope to see you all tomorrow, 9:30, back here. Thank you so much.